I still knew he was a testimony. And whenever I talked to him and whenever he told me, it had weight to it. I valued his thing. And that's what Paul did. He gave him his testimony, and he gave him the testimony of what God had done in people's lives. He didn't give his wisdom. Because God is not a respecter of person. If God moves in anyone's life, he will move in anyone's life who gives him permission to the degree that you give him yourself. He will move in your life. I mean, you see some people, these drug addicts, totally give their life over to Christ, and God does incredible stuff in their life. And then you see other people who maybe not as bad, just give a little bit of themselves to Jesus, ask him into their life, forgive their sins, and kind of God's not really moving that much. He's not a respecter of person. He'll give you everything. The Bible says all things are ours in Christ Jesus. And you can have whatever you desire. So if you desire him, he'll give you your desires. But you have to make your heart right. You have to, go after his desire, not go after the things of this world. So, and this is so true in Abraham. Remember, Abraham was tested. The one thing he loved, his son. God asked for it, and he was willing to give it. And what did he get? He got his son back. Plus, he got a ram. He got more. God's not really interested in your stuff. He just wants to give you more, but he wants to be that more. He wants to, pour out that abundance into your life. But he wants you to be a clean vessel, and he wants you to be passionate about him. It's really about passion, is really what it's about. And he'll give you more. If you're serious, what you're serious about, he's serious about. If it doesn't concern you, it probably doesn't concern him. If you're not crying about it, and you're like, that's cool. But, with these children, when they start crying, you're like, okay, what do you want? What do I have to do, And I don't want to create Christian crybabies where we're always crying to God for things. But really, we need to be really passionate about the lost and about things that God is passionate about. Because God don't want robots. He wants to make the best you, like what you were saying earlier. He knows what's best, and he wants you to be alive in him. He wants you to have that abundant life in him, though, not in yourself. He wants us to live in that resurrection power that he's given us. The Bible says we can live in resurrection power, and it's in there. Many times people can't relate to Jesus because they believe they're not like us. I don't know if you've experienced this, but a lot of times people, they look at you now that you're saved, and they think, well, you're not like me. You don't have my problems. I remember hearing this one preacher talk about how they suffered, and I'm like, I don't think you suffer the way I do. I couldn't relate to him, And sometimes people don't relate to us because they think we don't suffer. Because we present this gospel of, prosperity and peace and all this other stuff. And it's true, but it comes through, it has to be attached to Jesus. Say, you know what, I had this problem. When we give them our testimony, we always start with, you know what, my testimony was, I was in a really bad place. And I remember the day, and I cried out to God, and I should have been up all night worrying about my situation. And this presence of God came into the room and lifted that weight off my shoulders, and I just fell asleep. And the next day was Sunday, and I went to church. It was kind of like the Christmas Carol, where the guy wakes up and it's like, oh, wow, it's Sunday, I get to go to church. And I ran down the altar, because for weeks before, I was hanging on to my chair every altar call. I wasn't going down, I wasn't giving up, but God has a way of moving circumstances to move you towards him. And he did that for me. So people, if we present this perfect life, people, they have this delusion. So I think we need to be more open. I know I have to be. We shouldn't hide our problems. I mean, we shouldn't, always tell everybody our problems, be complaining. But, when somebody comes to you with a problem, say, I had that problem too. I had that exact same problem, but I gave it to Jesus. And Jesus is the answer. And it gives us an opportunity to tell them what Jesus did, all these problems. Next verse. chapter 2, verse, it says, I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. It's all about Jesus and what he did on the cross. You know, him crucified on the cross. He paid for our sin in full with his death. Totally. Totally. Past, present, and future. All sin is present. We are righteous because of what Jesus did on the cross. Totally. We don't have to walk in guilt. We don't have to have a culture of shame. We don't have to have all this blame game or all this stuff. It's done. It's over. It's finished. And that's our message, that it's finished, that he was reconciling. God was in Christ reconciling the world unto himself. He wanted to make friends with the world through Christ. That's how he did it. He suffered the death so we could have life. He suffered that death on the cross so we could have life. I know it's been said 100 times, but that's the essence of it. And it wasn't very attractive either, that death. I thought about that while I was studying this, the law of attraction. You know, Jesus never used that law of attraction. He wanted to make sure Christians and disciples were disciples. He'd tell them, well, you know, you need to honor your family. But if you love your family more than me, then you're not worthy of the kingdom. You know, he'd tell them all these things in conflict, you know, to make sure that they were passionate about him. And he preached his, you have to eat me sermon, you know. So, and everybody is like, you got to make a choice. Because there's always two trees in the garden. There's always that tree of God, and life, and abundant life, and there's always that tree of offense and intellectual reasoning and dishonor, and however you want to look at it. You know, a lot of times we despise people that bring the message of the cross. That's just a simple gospel. It's the gospel that Paul preached. Yet, you know, look at it. It's the opposite of everything in the world. Jesus was born in a manger, yet his story is declared in palaces to all kings throughout history. You know, he lived an obscure life, totally obscure, for 30 years. You know, he was just a carpenter. Yet, the parts that we do know changed the course of history. You know, he didn't have any education. They wondered where he got that education. He didn't go to school. I don't know how he slipped through the radar, because I know they had an educational system where they would bring up people, young men, and they would go from level to level. And somehow he must have flunked the test on purpose, just to go back to his carpentry shop to finish his tour there. Because they have, you know, they test them in the synagogue and everything. And the best of the best get promoted up, and they, you know, they get hired onto a rabbi, and they follow the rabbi around, and then they become a rabbi. Well, he didn't do that. He didn't follow the educational route. You know, he probably did enough Sunday school to get by, and then he went back to his carpentry shop for 30 years until it was his time. He didn't travel around a lot. He probably never left more than 100 miles from his hometown, if that. You know, didn't have great education, but no one ever spoke like him. The power. The people were offended because he spoke. They said, "Where did this guy get this wisdom?" You know, he's the classic anti-hero. You know, he's just a hero, but he doesn't follow all the forms and all the plans and all the purposes of man. How you would think you would get there. He doesn't follow it. All the things we put a premium on, he lived the greatest life ever lived without them. You know, we think we need the nice big house. He didn't have one, and he had a great life. He had power. He had power, you know. We think we need this, a car, and whatever, but he never drove in a car. He walked everywhere, except for a couple times he rode a donkey, but most of the time he walked. You know, all the things that we value, he doesn't value. Yet, he's the only way in mankind can be saved. Totally. He's the only way. It's a narrow way that opens up into a vast kingdom. And I know sometimes in the kingdom we can get lost in the vastness of the kingdom and all the things that the kingdom provides, and we can forget about that narrow way that we came in. Our life, it's all about him. It's all about Jesus. That's all it's about. It's all about him. It's not about all this other stuff. All this other stuff is fruit of it. But he is the root. Next verse says, "And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling." We need to do it afraid. I know in my life I have reasoned to myself out of preaching the gospel so many times.